Hi, this is Vinny from the iMoot team. I'd like to welcome you to Fred Nevers' session, running a multilingual Moodle more than installing language packs. Fred's a long-time supporter of the iMoot. Go visit his website, iteachwithmoodle.com. It is fantastic. There's some great stuff there on gamification. And it totally blows me away what this man can do with a Moodle database. So thank you very much for presenting at the iMoot Mini Moot this year, Fred. And I hope everyone watching enjoys the presentation.
Hey, thanks, Vinny, for the introduction. I'm just going to switch on my webcam for a few seconds just to say hi. So here I am. Hi. Yeah, my name's Fred. I currently work in Hong Kong for a school called the ISF Academy in Cyberport, for those of you who are familiar with Hong Kong. And the context of my school is it's an IB, so International Baccalaureate School, K-12, but it is bilingual. And we have a mandate at the school where everything that we do has to be provided to our community in English and in Chinese, in traditional Chinese. I've learned a lot about running a Moodle in different languages, and quickly found out that it's more than just installing language packs. I'd played with language packs in the past where I worked at other schools, but never to the extent that I have had in this organization. So I'm just going to switch off my webcam, and I'm just going to go ahead with the presentation. So please, if you've got any questions, you can write them, type them in the chat box, and I'll try and answer them at the end of the session. If you want to wait at the end, I'll give you the mic, and then we can do the Q&A like that as well. Okay. All right. So let me just switch that off. Okay. So here is my quick presentation. Thanks, Vinny, for plugging my website. I've got to tell you the truth. I've had a couple of kids since the last time I blogged, so it's been a while, but I've got a few things in the pipeline. Okay. So can you guys see the presentation that I've got on? Are you all good with that? Yeah? Okay, awesome. So in theory, Moodle supports all languages. That's in theory, all languages that are supported by the UTF standard. There are only two languages that are not considered dead languages that are not supported, and they're in the show notes that I'll share with you at the end of the session. I must say those are not languages that I'm familiar with, and I'm not quite sure how many people speak or read those languages, but there are only currently two languages that are not supported. So all of your main languages are supported in Moodle, or in theory could be supported. Currently, the Moodle.org website has 141 translations. Some of those translations are for main languages, and some of the translations are what we call child languages. So, for example, you may have English as the main language, and then in addition, so English for kids, for example, which is a child language. So only some of the strings are changed for this. So the idea is that Moodle has the ability to plug language packs in which translations are saved. And currently there are 141 on the Moodle.org website, obviously all free and available to the community. Okay, so you may be at a stage now where you're thinking of offering Moodle as a bilingual or multilingual site. So here are a few questions that you may want to ask yourself before you go ahead with it. Or if you've already gone ahead with it, maybe those questions will allow you to determine whether you offer more languages or whether you just go, hey, do you know what? Perhaps I shouldn't be going ahead, and you know, I don't really need those languages. So here are some questions that I've put together, or that I was asked when I relaunched Moodle at my current school. The first one is there a genuine need? Just because the language packs are available doesn't mean that you necessarily need to have that available. So who's your audience for example? Do you have access to the logs? Can you see which countries your users visit your site from, and things like that? So if there is a genuine need, like for example in my situation where there is a mandate from the school board that we must make everything available in 2 languages, if there wasn't, I've got to be honest, I don't think I would offer Moodle in another language, because in the situations I was in before, didn't really need to have another language than English. Yes, we had some of our students and some of our parents whose first language was not English, but the language of the organization was English, or were of the organizations was English. So that's why we decided not to have another language. So I guess that's the first question you've got to ask yourself. Second question, what languages need to be supported? Now, again, in your organization, you may have people whose first language is not English, but it doesn't mean that they won't be able to understand what is actually presented on the site. Now, there's something also that we've got to make very clear, is that in those language packs, only the words and the sentences that are available in the Moodle app, in the Moodle core and plugins, are available to translate. Any data that is input by users is not translated by default. So that's something that we'll touch upon later on in the presentation, but that's something to keep in mind. Is there a language policy in your organization? For example, the school I worked at before, we had what we called a mid-Atlantic English policy. So basically, there was no policy as long as you, as a person, as long as you had consistency in your writing, you could use English, British English or American English. That was perfectly fine. Those two were acceptable, but you had to be consistent in your use. At my current school, English is US English, so that's what we need to use. And when it comes to Chinese, it has to be traditional Chinese for the Pukunui language, or Mandarin, as it's said in English most often. So take a look, is there a language policy there? Because the default language for a Moodle installation is English Australian, which is, I believe, the same. It's just English, which is British English, from what I understand. I may be mistaken, but I believe that's the case. So if you've got different needs, you've got to look at that. Do you need to support right to left languages? For example, Arabic is an example. The reason why this is important is that your theme must be able to support right to left languages. Not all themes do. Now, all core themes do, but if you've purchased a theme from maybe from a partner, a Moodle partner, or maybe from Theme Forest or something like that, there is a chance that right to left languages are not supported or not well supported. So it's a good idea to take a look at that before you make the language packs available. It could make your Moodle look a bit funny. Does the operating system that Moodle sit on support all of the languages that are needed? There are some languages that need special characters which are not available by default on some of the Linux distributions, for example. Now, those may be considered an quote-unquote exotic languages by some, but depending on your needs, they might not be exotic at all. They might be the actual languages that you need. So that's something that you want to be careful with. Also, it may have an impact on how days and months and things like that are displayed on your calendars in Moodle. So that's something you've got to take a look at. Now, chances are that the languages you need are supported by your operating system, but it's just something to make sure of. Another one that I've come across before is if your school or organization manages user devices. For example, you know, if your organization gives out phones to employees, or say MacBooks or Chromebooks or whatever to their students and teachers, you've got to make sure that the language packs that are necessary, the input, for example, the keyboards, you know how you can get different keyboards, you can switch to virtual keyboards and things like that. You've got to make sure that those are available to users and they're allowed to use them and to switch. I've worked in fairly locked down environments before where students needed to be given permissions to do things like that. It's not currently the case, but that's something I've seen before, so that might be something you want to look at as well. This one is quite an interesting one. So now there are 141 language packs in Moodle, as I said earlier on, but not all of them cover 100% of the strings. That's the term that is used in the language pack. So let me show you, for example, what this looks like. So this is a screenshot I took off a Moodle.org last night, and you can see that there are some language packs that are available. So the first one's Afrikaans, and it states that 8% of the language strings have been translated. Now, that number that you see, 22,501, again, I may be mistaken, but I believe that's the case, are all of the core strings to Moodle, plus all of the plugins that have been accepted in the plugin database that's available on Moodle. So you know, when you want to install something else on your Moodle, there's a plugins database. Once your plugin as a developer has been added to the database, I believe that a sort of a bucket is made available on the Moodle translation tool that we'll take a look at later on, and that becomes basically your strings for your plugin become available as part of the pool of strings that need to be translated. So it could very well be that the 8% that you see for Afrikaans here is actually all of the Moodle core strings that have been translated, for example. Now, a way for you to find out is to download the language pack, to install it, and then take a look, just navigate the site and see the extent to which things have been translated. Now, some languages are translated to a higher extent than others. Most of the packages are looked after by the Moodle community, and some of the main ones are managed by the by Moodle HQ with help from the community as well. Again, that's something we'll take a look at a bit later, see how you guys can contribute to the language situation on Moodle. Okay. That's another question that you may ask yourself. In your organization, who will support the language packs? If you don't have someone who is able to read and write in the language or the languages that you need to support, whenever an update is made to the site, to Moodle or to any of the plugins, you may run into the possibility that some of the strings are new and are not yet translated. Now, as I said earlier on, some of the languages, I would say most of the languages, are looked after by the Moodle community, and they may not always be available to do the translations as soon as the new plugins come out. So it would really help if you had someone who could support your language pack, or even better, support the language pack for the community in your organization. So that's something you've got to think about. This one is quite an interesting one. In my context, and it's not the first time, pretty much at every school that I've worked at, which have been international schools, names have always been very interesting to look after. Currently, in my organization, a student may have a bunch of names. So one, legal last name, legal first name, legal middle name, all of that in English, and then the same thing in Chinese. Then we get the preferred name. That is also something that can be done in English or in Chinese, although, to be fair, the only preferred names I've ever seen have been in English. But right there, we've got 7 pieces of information just for something that traditionally we don't see as a problem. Names we just think, oh, that's easy to deal with. Well, it can be very difficult. So it's a good idea to take a look at in your organization how names are dealt with, and if you have any edge cases that need to be looked after, because that will impact your language packs and how you display the names. This is an interesting one. The system that we used to use at my organization used to display both languages at once, so English and Chinese next to one another. To my knowledge, there isn't a pack in Moodle that allows you to do that. Now, we have changed that policy, and now it's only available in English or in Chinese. But there are circumstances where, say, an English colleague will speak to a Chinese colleague, and they want to have access to the information that they read in both in English and in Chinese. Currently, the system that we have does not support that. So we are looking at maybe, perhaps in the future, adding a pack which has two languages side by side. But we are quite concerned that this will have an impact on the user interface and the usability of the software. So we need to do a lot of testing about this, a lot of testing on this. Okay, but that's something you want to look at. You may want to look at as well. Now, those are some of the questions that are probably a good idea to ask yourselves before you offer different languages. But now let's say that you know which languages you want to offer. What is the process for that? And are there any caveats? Now, I found a few. Now, the documentation in Moodle on Moodle.org is very good, but some of it is fragmented a little bit between different pages. So here I'm just going to collate everything and talk about some of the issues that I've come across before. So that's the process. The first thing is to install other language packs. Now that's very easy. You can just go into site administration, language, and then language packs, and you can install any of the language packs that are on the right-hand side. Now you can see currently I've got 3 language packs installed on my Moodle installation. And there are 2 buttons underneath, either uninstall the language packs or update all of the installed language packs. Now, the update actually happens on a daily basis automatically, so I don't really have to worry about that. But that's something you might want to be aware of if you don't have your cron working properly. It won't update your language packs automatically. The next thing you want to do is to set your language settings. You want to do that. And here there are a few things you may want to think about. Now, the language auto detect is something that we do not do because we don't want to make assumptions. When working in a bilingual environment, it's very difficult for the computer to make a decision as to what language should be used when. So we have switched that off completely, and I wish Chrome would let us manage those language, detections a bit better as well, because it's not fantastic. It often translates pages when we don't want it, and vice versa. So that's not something that we're very, very pleased with. It doesn't do a very good job of guessing what we want. Default language, again, that's up to you, I suppose, what that language is in your organization. The language menu is what you'll see traditionally in the nav bar. So I'll show you a quick demo of my site a bit later to show you what it looks like. But, if you don't display that language menu, it's going to be very difficult for users to, to switch from one language to another. Although you could make other arrangements, your own buttons and things like that. Okay. The languages on language menu are all the languages that you offer on your site. So here I've got 3 different ones. You'll note that each language is defined by its sort of ISO code, which you can find on the language pack on the page I showed you before. And then they're separated with a comma, and there are no spaces between the commas. Okay. Cached language menu, that's just for speed, I guess, for performance reasons. We like to cache the language menu, but whenever we change the strings, we have to purge the caches just to make sure that people can see the changes that we've made. Here, the site-wide locale, we're not using this. We've never found a need for it yet, but that's something that might be important to you. And if you read the descriptions underneath the box, that'll make more sense than what I'm going to say. So I think the description is very good. So those are the basic language settings that you got to go through. Now, some of the settings, some of the other settings will actually impact the language aspect of your Moodle. One of them is the course settings. By default, you have the ability to set your default to courses per course. Will teachers or course managers be able to force a specific language to be used? For example, even though we are in a bilingual environment at my current workplace, there are some teachers, say our Chinese colleagues, who want students to be visiting their course in Chinese and not in English, for example. So that is something that they're able to force. By default, it is not forced on our site, and I believe that's the default as well, but that's something that you can do. All right, so that's one of the course settings that's going to affect languages on your site. Another one is how you define calendars. Now, you may or may not know that calendars are now a plugin on Moodle. So we assume that the year is 2016. Well, that's not quite the case everywhere. I believe it's 2,559 in Thailand right now. And then, in other parts of the world, in the Middle East, for example, there may be other countries on different years. They may be following different months, for example. A weekday is not the same as a weekend. For example, say, I don't know, like Saturday in Dubai, Friday might be a day off in Dubai, and Sunday is a working day, for example. So those are things that will affect the language of your site and how things are displayed. So here, there are currently 3 different calendar plugins on Moodle, on the Moodle.org database. You can go and take a look at those. And here are some of the settings that may change the way things are displayed and shown on your website. So some of the settings I told you about earlier on, start of the week, weekend days, and so on. Something to keep in mind. One of the other things you may want to do is to customize the language. I'll show you a quick demo of this in a few minutes, but you have the ability to change, just for your site, some of the strings that you have. So later on, I'll show you maybe how to change a few strings, and if we have time, maybe how to display names, for example. But the tools is under site administration, language customization. Okay. Now, the one I've just showed you just now is if you want to make changes to your language pack, things that other people who use the same language pack would not benefit from. But there are times where there may be typos that need to be corrected, mistakes, or additions that need to be made to the language pack. For example, over the summer, we had an intern who worked for us, and we asked her to add the strings that we're missing from the Taiwan Chinese, which is traditional Chinese, so that other members of the Moodle community could benefit from that. And she did an awesome job. She translated hundreds and hundreds of different strings, and she added them to a tool called Amos, which I'll show you, which is used to actually manage strings and feed them into language packs that other sites can use as well. So for this is the this is the tool. It's called Amos, and you have to create a special account to get onto it. But the system is fairly simple. You log in as a user, you go and choose the plugin or the string that you want to change or you want to add. It shows you the main string in English, if English is the main language, and it allows you to translate the string. Now, as soon as the string is translated, you can send it for review, and that string is reviewed by whoever maintains that language pack, and then the changes are either accepted or sent back to you. When they are accepted, they get added that very night to the language pack, and then all the Moodle sites that are attached to, that have that language pack installed, get updated as well. So really, you really do a great thing for the community by doing that. And please do understand that the AMOS translation kit is not just for Moodle core, it's also for the plugins that have been submitted by the community. So for example, the certificate plugin or the checklist plugin, or all those plugins that are not done by Moodle headquarters, but they are also available through the Moodle translation tool. Okay, so that's something, if you're not a programmer, for example, but you have specific skills in language translation, that's a way that you can give back to the Moodle community without a huge amount of effort. There are a few plugins that are available to make your life a bit easier and to allow you to do things that are very tricky to do by default. Now, remember earlier on in the presentation, I mentioned that only the strings, only the words and sentences that are available in Moodle and the plugins are translated in the language packs. Now, if you enter something as a user, say for example the name of an activity or a label with some text in there, the text will not be translated automatically. Now the good thing is someone created a great plugin called the multilanguage filter v2, actually it's version 2, and it improves the multi-language filter capabilities of Moodle, the standard multi-language filter, which is quite tricky to use. So the idea is fairly simple. This is an image from the site, from the moodle.org site. So say this is a label, I believe, yeah, that label text. So the yellow part will only be visible to people who have set their language to Spanish. The purple part is going to be available to everybody because it hasn't, language has not been defined. And the red part at the bottom is only visible to people who've set English as their language. And that really is quite cool. I'll show you how to use it briefly in a few minutes, but that is something that you may want to include. So I'll put the address in the show notes at the end of this presentation. Another plugin that you might want to use in conjunction with the multi-language filter v2 is the Atto plugin to make it easier, even easier, to create multi-language content. So whenever you have a string that you've written, piece of text, you can define what language that string should be visible in. So you know, should this be just in English, should it be in Spanish, or this language, which I'm not sure what it is, but you know, this is something that allows people with no programming background whatsoever to make their content available in different languages. You can do other things, user input data that cannot be taken care of by the filter. This one is not really for the faint of heart, but you can, using a bit of jQuery in your code, if you've got admin access to your website, you can actually add some code. And then briefly what this does, it just checks what the current language is of the person who is logged in. In this particular case, if the language is Chinese Taiwan, or if it's traditional Chinese or simplified Chinese, then it needs to replace some of the text which in English says Chinese language with the Chinese equivalent, and here the string that which says English language with the Chinese equivalent. As I said, this is not for the faint of heart, and it really is for data that doesn't change. Now, we use it for some of our course names in primary school, but none in secondary school. So I won't actually be able to show you that, but that's the idea. And there's another thing that I found out recently, actually, This is not something I've used before, but entire courses can be translated using a strategy or a technique that's explained in this blog post. Again, the link is actually available in the presentation that I'll give you at the end of this presentation. And it shows you how to export a course, to back it up, to change the strings, and then re-upload it into Moodle to with all the translated strings. Again, not something I've done, but I've read good things about it, and people have used it, and it seems to be working. So that's something you may want in your arsenal. Now, I'm just going to spend really quickly, maybe 5 minutes or so, to show you some of the things I talked to you about. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully that'll work. Don't know why this is happening. All right. Okay, so my screen sharing was working perfectly fine a few seconds ago, so I'm just going to run it again. Yes, please bear with me. If you do have questions, please write them down in the chat now. It will only take me a minute to get everything started. Okay. So I should be sharing my screen now. Am I? Nothing yet. Okay, we'll work on it, continue working on it. Apologies for that technical issue. Okay, so yeah, I can see that, Scott, you're using your middle name as your main name. That is some of the challenges that we have at our current workplace is that some of the preferred names may change throughout the life of a student at our school. So that's always interesting and challenging, but it's always good fun. Unfortunately, the screen share has decided not to work anymore. So I'm just going to leave for a second, and I'll come back in a couple of minutes. Okay. Okay, so it seems to be working now, right? Okay, awesome. So let me show you real quick what I meant by some of the stuff that I was showing you earlier on. So I'm going to go to my Moodle site. I can't see the chat, just so you know, but please go ahead and write questions and things if you want. And the first thing I want to show you is how to change some of the strings that are in your Moodle site. Now, in order for you to do this, is you have to go to your language here, and then language customization. Now it's going to say, hey, which language do you want to modify? I'm going to go for English. Now I'm going to load the language pack. This can take a while because it's quite a big process, especially if you've got a lot of plugins installed. So hopefully this won't die on me, but it may take a short while for that to happen. Okay. All right. So just need to click on continue for that to happen, and obviously this happens because why not? Hopefully that won't last too long. While this is happening, I'm just going to launch the Moodle translation tool. Okay. There you go. Hopefully, no, still not. translation. So it's lang.moodle.org, and that is something that you need a different account for. So hopefully my login still works for this. Of course it doesn't. All right, never mind. What I really am interested in is this language pack here. If I can't get it to work within the next 30 seconds or so, I'm just going to move on to the next item. I don't want to waste your time, but it should work really. You know. So let me open a new Moodle page, and I'll show you while we're waiting for this to happen. I'll just show you what the plugins do. The multi-language filter plugin. I'll show you what they do. So if you click Add Activity Resource and click Add a Label, for example, you get your Atto editor, and then I'm going to cheat a little bit and just maybe use French instead, but that'll be close enough. You'll get the gist of it. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to say, look, this should only be visible in English. So I'm going to say this, oops, and this should only be visible in French. But for this, we'll just do Chinese. Now, in typical fashion, this isn't working. I have no idea why. We use it a fair amount. I wonder if the screen sharing is yep, it's not working on this. So let me just try and use Firefox. This probably is the worst the worst tech session I've ever done. Usually at least one thing is working. Okay, so I'm just going to turn on the editing and go through the process again. Add my label, click Add, and we're good to go again. All right. Okay, so let's try again. And I'm going to set this to English. There you go. And it's adding the tags that are necessary for this to work properly. Okay. And I'm going to say save and return to course. And now I can see only the English version because I am logged in and I'm using English as my main language. Now, if I want to use traditional Chinese, obviously I should have put something in Chinese, but I can't type in Chinese or speak it for that matter. So I just used something in French instead, but the idea is the same. Now, one tip that I may have about this is we found that maybe it's theme related, I'm not sure, but we have found that if you put things on different lines, the things that's hidden actually takes up space anyhow. So you don't see it technically, but it's sort of taken a blank space. So we prefer to put things next to one another, if you will, on there. I don't have a need to have a course in dual languages, but some of our teachers do. So that's something you may want to look at. Let me just go back to the language pack just to see if it's finished loading. Yes, it has. And I'll show you how to change some of the things. So here, I'm going to go and look for the profanity filter and go and change some of the things. So let me just look for it. It's called censor. But it isn't here. So it is in... it's a filter, so here it is. So I'm going to go and load this particular part of Moodle, and please, if you're easily offended by written swear words, look away now because there are a few in there. And actually, most of the time, what I do is I edit the language pack, but I edit the language pack in a different way. I remove some of the identifiers. So here, for example, these are the words that are by default, but actually this particular word here, which I will not say, quite often we need it because it's part of types of food in English, British English, for example, or if your name is, say, Emily Dickinson, for example, well, that will actually make the it will make for interesting conversations for no real reason. So we tend to change that. I added it today for the presentation, but we tend to change those things, and that is something you can do at the language level as well. So you can go and edit those as well, and that's something for you to keep in mind. The Amos, I won't have time to show you because we're running out of time. But please, if you do have any, if you know any other language than English, or if you want to change any of the strings in English that you know are wrong, if there are mistakes, for example, please go ahead and use this tool because it'll be fed back to the Moodle community. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm going to go back to the main big blue button, and I'm open for questions. So if you want to ask questions, I can give you the mic, or you can use the chat box as well. So yeah, shoot. Not all at once. Yeah. Okay, it seems as though there are no questions, so I'm not sure whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but as I said, I'll make the presentation available where you'll have all the links and such.
Hi, Fred, Vinny here. I was going to type in chat, but it's just easier for me to talk. Yeah, I was just going to chime in and just emphasize how useful it is. Just editing the English versions of the language strings, just to change descriptions, change how certain things are referred to, just to make all these great big site-wide changes. Yeah, it's really useful. So if you haven't had a look at those guys, then it's probably worth poking around in.
Yeah, that's a great point you're making, actually. For example, a rubric might not be called a rubric at your school. It might be called a set of criteria, for example. A co-teacher might not be called a co-teacher. By the way, some of the changes that you make for stuff like that, it might not be necessary to do it at the language pack level, but it might be better off done at the rename roles. So, if a teacher is not called a teacher, for example, if you want a teacher to be called an instructor, or if you want a teacher to be called a facilitator, for example, it might be best to do it at the role level, where you do the role rename rather than in the language pack. Just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, good point.
But yeah, so thank you very much for being a good audience, and I look forward to some of the other sessions that are going to take place in the next 16 hours or so. Yeah,
thanks once again, Fred, for presenting. Great session, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the iMoot as well. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Cheers. See ya.